There are monsters who wear suits and smile at family dinners. There are killers who shake hands with judges and walk free streets. But in the dark underworld of organized crime, there existed a man so violent, so unpredictable, that even the Mafia, an organization built on brutality, decided he had to die. His name was Joseph Barboza, and they called him the Animal. This is the story of how a mob hitman became so dangerous that the very men who created him had to destroy him. September 20th, 1932 marked the birth of a child in New Bedford, Massachusetts, who would grow into one of the most feared men in American organized crime. Joseph Barboza, Jr. came into this world as the son of Portuguese immigrants from Valpacos, a small town in the Alto Trasos Montes region. His father, Joseph Barboza, Sr., had tried his hand at professional boxing in Los Angeles, stepping into the ring only twice, once against Pete Frisco in January 1933, and again against Carlos Chipras that April, before abandoning the brutal sport. His mother, Palmeda Camille, worked as a seamstress, her fingers dancing across fabric while her husband's dreams of boxing glory faded into memory. Young Joseph grew up alongside two brothers, Donald and Anthony, and a sister named Ann Houghton, in a household where Portuguese was spoken as often as English. The boy who would become the Animal never received much formal education, dropping out before completing 8th grade, leaving him barely literate in English. Yet, despite his struggles with reading and writing, Joseph possessed a remarkable gift for languages, speaking fluent Portuguese, Italian, and Spanish, an ability that would serve him well in the multicultural criminal underworld of Boston. He married a Jewish woman and, by 1965, had fathered a daughter, later adding a son to his family while living in Chelsea, Massachusetts. On the surface, he appeared to be just another working-class father trying to provide for his family through his employment with the Patriarca crime family. But that employment involved activities that would make any normal person's blood run cold. The physical presence of Joseph Barboza was enough to unsettle anyone who crossed his path. He was built like a compact fighting machine, stocky and muscular, with a neck thick as a tree trunk and an angular skull shaped like a watermelon. This intimidating frame housed a violent temperament that revealed itself early in his teenage years when he began committing robberies and assaults. At 18 years old in 1950, the Massachusetts justice system sent him to the Massachusetts Correctional Institution in Concord for a 5-year sentence. Prison was supposed to break him, to teach him the consequences of violence. But instead it became a stage where Joseph would demonstrate just how uncontrollable he truly was. The summer of 1953 witnessed the largest prison break in the 75-year history of the Massachusetts Correctional Institution. Joseph Barboza, not content to serve his time quietly, orchestrated a wild escape that would become legendary in New England criminal lore. He and 6 other inmates had somehow obtained contraband whiskey and amphetamine tablets, transforming themselves into a drugged and drunken mob. In their altered state, they overpowered 4 prison guards and commandeered 2 separate vehicles, racing away from confinement with the taste of freedom on their lips. But freedom for these men didn't mean hiding and planning a new life. It meant unleashing chaos on an unsuspecting public. During their brief time outside prison walls, Barboza and his fellow escapees terrorized Boston like a pack of wild dogs. They beat random people in the streets for no reason other than the pleasure of violence, cruised through the bars of Boston's Scollay Square looking for trouble, and wandered to the neighborhoods of Lynn and Revere, leaving fear in their wake. Their rampage finally ended at a subway station in East Boston, where police apprehended them after barely 24 hours of freedom. The escape had been spectacular in its audacity and brief in its duration, but it revealed something crucial about Joseph Barboza's character. He was a man who couldn't control his violent impulses. Even when doing so would serve his own interests. While awaiting trial for the prison break that November, Barboza provided further evidence of his unstable nature by slugging a prison guard in the cafeteria without provocation. 3 months later, demonstrating either remarkable courage or complete disregard for consequences, he threw a table at a guard's chest when the man entered his cell. These weren't calculated acts of rebellion. They were the spontaneous eruptions of a man whose violence existed just beneath the surface, ready to explode at any moment. The guards and administrators at the Massachusetts Correctional Institution must have breathed a collective sigh of relief when Joseph Barboza finally completed his sentence and walked out of their facility, the young man who emerged from prison in the mid-1950s entered a Boston where organized crime was undergoing significant changes. The city's criminal landscape was divided among various factions, Italian mafia families, Irish gangs, and independent operators, all vying for control of lucrative rackets like gambling, loan sharking, and extortion. Raymond L.S. Patriarca, a shrewd and ruthless mob boss based in Providence, Rhode Island, was working to consolidate power across New England, and he needed men who could enforce his will through fear and violence. Joseph Barboza, with his proven capacity for brutality and his multilingual skills, was exactly the kind of soldier Patriarca's organization could use. By January 1966, Barboza had become a powerful and feared figure in Boston's criminal underworld. Law enforcement circles widely believed he had performed numerous contract killings for Raymond Patriarca, though proving these murders in court was another matter entirely. His reputation for violence was so extreme that other criminals gave him a nickname that would follow him to his grave: the Animal. This wasn't a term of endearment or respect in the traditional sense. It was an acknowledgement that Joseph Barboza had crossed lines that even hardened criminals recognized as boundaries. When collecting overdue loan payments for the mob's loan sharking operations, Barboza displayed a sadism that shocked even his criminal associates. In a 1970 television interview, speaking with an eerie calmness that made his words even more disturbing, Barboza explained his collection methods without a hint of remorse. After 14 weeks, he said, if debtors continued to hide from their obligations, he would stab them. Not just once, not just to send a message, but repeatedly and methodically. He stabbed them in the face, in the legs, in the arms, in the chest, anywhere his blade could reach. During one collection attempt, Barboza got into a fight with a debtor and, in a moment of savage fury, bit off part of the man's cheek and spat it onto the ground. In another instance, after shooting a man in the head, Barboza picked up a piece of the victim's skull that had blown off and gnawed on it like a dog with a bone. These weren't stories meant to intimidate. These were facts confirmed by witnesses and law enforcement, evidence of a man whose violence had evolved beyond anything resembling normal criminal behavior. Even his automobile reflected his paranoid and aggressive lifestyle. Barboza drove a 1965 Oldsmobile Cutlass that law enforcement officers referred to as the James Bond car because of its sophisticated features. The vehicle had an advanced alarm system to prevent tampering and a special device that could make thick black smoke pour from the tailpipe, presumably to aid in escapes during police chases. This wasn't the car of a small-time hood. This was the vehicle of a man who expected people to come after him and who wanted to be ready when they did. The mid-1960s in Boston were defined by a bloody gang war that would claim nearly 50 lives and reshape the criminal landscape of New England. The conflict, known as the McLean-McLaughlin Gang War, began in 1961 and escalated into a full-scale battle for territory and respect. On one side stood the McLean Gang, led by James "Buddy" McLean, who controlled criminal operations in the Charlestown and Somerville areas. On the other side was the McLaughlin Gang from Charlestown, led by brothers Bernie and Edward McLaughlin. This wasn't a fight over ideology or principles. It was a war over money, territory, and pride. And it turned Boston's streets into a shooting gallery where anyone connected to either side became a target. Raymond Patriarca, watching this chaos unfold, saw both a problem and an opportunity. The violence was bad for business, disrupting the steady flow of profits from illegal gambling and loan sharking operations, but it also provided a chance to eliminate rivals and consolidate power under his control. In 1965, desperate for hitmen and enforcers who could help his organization gain dominance, Patriarca recruited the 34-year-old Joseph Barboza. The animal had found his true calling, using his capacity for violence in service of the most powerful crime family in New England. Barboza aligned himself with the Winter Hill Gang, in part because James "Buddy" McLean was an ally of Vincent Flemmi and his brother Stephen Flemmi, both of whom Barboza trusted. As early as 1965, FBI agent H. Paul Rico had begun cultivating a relationship with Barboza, recognizing that the violent enforcer might one day become useful as an informant. Rico used Barboza's trust in the Flemmi brothers to gradually build a connection, planting seeds that would later bloom into betrayal. But in 1965 and 66, Barboza was still a loyal soldier for Patriarca, and he went to work with terrifying efficiency. The list of Barboza's victims during this period reads like a casualty report from a war zone. Edward McLaughlin, one of the leaders of the opposing gang, fell to Barboza's gun. Brothers Cornelius Hughes and Stevie Hughes were both murdered between 1965 and 66, their deaths attributed to the animal's work. These weren't clean professional hits. They were brutal executions meant to send a message to anyone who might oppose Patriarca's control. Barboza later claimed to have killed 26 people during the 3-year gang war, a number that, if accurate, would make him one of the most prolific hitmen in American mob history. The brief, but bloody, purge that Barboza conducted allowed the Patriarca crime family to dominate Boston streets and criminal rackets once again. Gambling operations, loan sharking businesses, and protection rackets fell under Patriarca's control as rivals either died or fled the city. For Raymond Patriarca, Joseph Barboza had proven himself to be an invaluable asset, a weapon that could be pointed at any target and trusted to eliminate it with extreme prejudice. But weapons, especially unstable ones, can be dangerous to those who wield them. In 1966, Boston police pulled over Barboza's Oldsmobile during a routine traffic stop and discovered an arsenal of weapons in the vehicle. The gun charges were serious, and bail was set at an astronomical $100,000, a sum designed to keep dangerous criminals behind bars. Barboza, sitting in jail, expected his boss, Raymond Patriarca, to post bail, or at least provide substantial help toward raising the money. After all, he had killed for the family, had risked his life repeatedly in their service, and had helped secure Patriarca's control over Boston's criminal rackets. In the twisted logic of organized crime, loyalty was supposed to run both ways. But Raymond Patriarca had a different view of the situation. When some of Barboza's criminal associates managed to raise more than $80,000 toward the bail amount, demonstrating remarkable loyalty to their imprisoned friend, Patriarca made a decision that would change everything. The mob boss had 3 of these men killed and their money taken, adding it to his own coffers. It was a cold calculation. Barboza was useful, but he was also volatile and drawing too much attention from law enforcement. With the animal safely locked up, Patriarca saw an opportunity to eliminate loose ends and increase his profits. He took over Barboza's loan sharking racket, absorbing the revenue that had previously belonged to his enforcer. When word of these betrayals reached Barboza in jail, the animal's rage must have been incandescent. FBI agents Dennis Condon and H. Paul Rico, who had been cultivating Barboza for years, chose this moment to make their move. They visited Barboza in jail and played for him an illicit recording they had made of Raymond Patriarca. On the tape, Barboza heard his boss, the man he had killed for, the man whose control of Boston he had secured through murder, calling him a bum and expendable. The words cut deeper than any knife because they revealed a fundamental truth that Barboza had refused to acknowledge. To Raymond Patriarca, the animal had never been a valued member of the family. He had been a tool, useful while he served a purpose, but disposable when he became inconvenient. The betrayal was complete. The Patriarca family, for which Barboza had faithfully collected, beaten, and killed, had turned against him. They had stolen from him, murdered his friends, and made it clear that they viewed him as expendable. Worse, Barboza learned that members of the organization had threatened to kill him, his wife, his young children, and other members of his family. For a man whose entire identity was built on loyalty to the criminal code and the mob family, this rejection was devastating. But Joseph Barboza was not the type of man to accept defeat quietly. If the Patriarca family had decided he was expendable, he would show them just how wrong that assessment was. In 1967, Joseph Barboza agreed to become an FBI informant in exchange for immunity from prosecution, safety for his family, and the opportunity to get revenge against the mob that had betrayed him. For him, becoming a stoolie, normally the most unforgivable sin in the criminal underworld, was his only option. He couldn't return to the streets while the Patriarca family wanted him dead. He couldn't protect his family from behind bars, and he certainly couldn't get revenge while sitting in a cell. By cooperating with the FBI, Barboza would become a government witness, sending his former associates to prison while securing protection for himself and his loved ones. The FBI, thrilled to have such a high-ranking mob figure willing to testify, took extraordinary measures to keep Barboza safe. They transferred him to Thatcher Island, a remote location off Cape Ann, and arranged for his transportation over water to the mainland whenever he needed to testify in court. The security was so tight that Patriarca allegedly sought to hire snipers on speedboats to shoot Barboza during these water transfers. The mob boss understood that the animal's testimony could destroy his organization, and he was willing to spend enormous resources to prevent that from happening. But the FBI's protection held, and Barboza began appearing in courtrooms to tell stories about murders, extortion, and the inner workings of the Patriarca crime family. On March 12, 1965, a small-time criminal named Edward "Teddy" Deegan was found dead in an alleyway in Chelsea, Massachusetts. He had been shot multiple times in what police described as a gangland-style execution. The murder of Deegan was one of dozens that occurred during the Boston gang wars, but it would become one of the most consequential in American legal history. FBI agents had actually known about the planned hit on Deegan before it happened, receiving information about it as early as March 10, 1965. Internal FBI memos written by Agent H. Paul Rico were dated March 10th and March 13th, but neither was distributed within the FBI until March 15th, 3 days after Deegan's murder. A March 19th, 1965 memo from the Boston Division of the FBI to Director J. Edgar Hoover named 5 people as responsible for killing Deegan: Ronald Casesso, Joseph Romeo Martin, James Jimmy Fleming, Roy French, and Joseph Barboza. The memo detailed how French had walked behind Deegan when they were entering a building and fired the first shot, hitting him in the back of the head. Casesso and Martin then shot Deegan from the front, ensuring he was dead. This memo, written just days after the murder and based on FBI intelligence, correctly identified the actual killers. But when the case went to trial in 1968, none of this information was presented to the court. Instead, Joseph Barboza took the witness stand and testified that completely different men were responsible for Deegan's murder. He named Joseph Salvati, Louis Greco, Henry Tamaleo, and Peter Limoni as the killers. These 4 men had not been mentioned in any of the FBI's internal memos about the Deegan murder. They were not involved in the crime. They were innocent. But Barboza's testimony was compelling, and his status as a government witness gave him credibility with the jury. All 4 men were convicted of murdering Edward Deegan. 4 of the accused received death sentences, while 2 others were sentenced to life imprisonment. The FBI agents who had recruited Barboza as an informant, Dennis Condon and H. Paul Rico, said nothing during the trial about the memos that identified the real killers. Edward Harrington, the Department of Justice lawyer who prosecuted the case, later claimed he never saw the memos that Agent Rico had written regarding Barboza's involvement in the Deegan murder. Even years later, after the truth began emerging, Harrington maintained He was satisfied that Barboza was telling the truth. This stance was difficult to understand given the documented evidence that Barboza had perjured himself, but it reflected the government's deep investment in protecting their star witness and the convictions he had helped secure. The Deegan case was not an isolated instance of Barboza's willingness to lie under oath. His testimony about Raymond Patriarca ordering the murder of an independent dice game operator named Willie Marfeo resulted in a murder conspiracy. Conviction in 1970 for the mob boss and 2 of his associates. Patriarca received a 10-year prison sentence, a huge blow to his organization, and a significant victory for the FBI and Justice Department. By that time, approximately 50 of the Patriarca family's 75 members were dead in prison, charged with crimes or working as informants. The organization that had once dominated New England's criminal underworld was in shambles, and Joseph Barboza could claim much of the credit for its destruction. After providing his testimony in the Deegan case and other trials, Barboza entered the newly created Witness Protection Program, becoming its very first participant. The FBI relocated him to Santa Rosa, California, giving him a new identity and enrolling him in cooking school, as if a man who had spent his adult life collecting debts through violence and committing murders could simply reinvent himself as a chef. The government provided him with money, a new background story, and the promise that his past would remain hidden. For a few years, it seemed like the arrangement might work. Barboza lived under the name Joe Donati, trying to build a life far from the blood-soaked streets of Boston. But men like Joseph Barboza don't simply disappear into quiet suburban lives. The violence that had defined him, the betrayals he had committed, the enemies he had made, these weren't things that could be erased with a new name and a cooking certificate. In Boston, members of the Patriarca crime family had not forgotten what the animal had done to their organization. His testimony had sent their boss to prison, had destroyed their operations, and had brought unprecedented law enforcement attention to their activities. As far as they were concerned, Joseph Barboza had violated the most sacred rule of organized crime. He had talked. And there was only one punishment for that transgression. Gennaro Jerry Angiulo, the underboss of the Patriarca crime family, took on the responsibility of tracking down Barboza. Angiulo was a meticulous and patient man, willing to wait years for the right opportunity to exact revenge. When he finally learned that Barboza was living in the San Francisco Bay Area under the name Joe Donati, Angiulo began planning the hit. He assigned the task to Caporegime Ilario M.A. Zanino and mob soldier Joseph Russo, 2 experienced and reliable killers who could be trusted to complete the job without complications. The setup was simple but effective. James Chalmers, an old friend and mob associate of Barboza, still lived in San Francisco's Sunset District. Chalmers contacted Barboza and invited him to visit, playing on their old friendship and Barboza's nostalgia for the criminal life he had left behind. Barboza, despite all his years as a hitman and his experience with betrayal, apparently didn't suspect anything unusual about the invitation. On February 11, 1976, he drove to Chalmas's residence near the corner of 25th Avenue and Moraga Street. Zanino and Russo waited patiently, watching the house from their van. They had been given clear instructions. Joseph Barboza needed to die, and the killing needed to send a message to anyone else who might consider cooperating with law enforcement. When Barboza finally emerged from Chalmas's residence and walked toward his parked car, pulling out his key to unlock the door, the van suddenly rolled up fast beside him. Before Barboza could react, before the instincts that had kept him alive through decades of gang wars could warn him of danger, an open door on the van revealed Zanino and Russo at almost point-blank range. 4 shotgun blasts erupted in the quiet residential neighborhood, the sound echoing off houses where families were eating dinner and children were doing homework. Joseph the Animal Barboza, the man who had bitten off a debtor's cheek, who had gnawed on a piece of skull, who had killed 26 people during the Boston gang wars, who had betrayed the Patriarca crime family and sent dozens of men to prison. This man collapsed on the sidewalk, his blood pooling on the concrete. He was 43 years old. The killers who had hunted him for years drove away, their mission accomplished. For years, the identities of Barbosa's murderers remained officially unknown. The San Francisco Police Department investigated the killing, but witnesses were scarce, and those who had seen something were unwilling to talk. It seemed like Joseph Barbosa's death would remain just another unsolved mob hit, one more body in the long history of organized crime in America. But the FBI's habit of planting listening devices in mob social clubs would eventually reveal the truth. In 1981, 5 years after Barbosa's murder, FBI agents monitoring bugged conversations at a social club near Boston's Old North Church recorded Gennaro Angiulo and Ilario Zannino discussing various criminal matters. During one of these conversations, Zannino spoke respectfully about Joseph Russo's role in orchestrating the Bay Area hit, calling him a brilliant guy. Zannino also implicated himself as one of the shooters in the murder. The FBI now had recorded evidence identifying Barbosa's killers, though by that point, prosecuting them for the crime would be complicated by the passage of time and questions about how the evidence had been obtained. Edward Harrington, the former Department of Justice lawyer who had prosecuted the Deegan case, offered a chilling assessment of Barbosa's death. The former mob hitman had paid the penalty for cooperating with the United States government. This statement inadvertently revealed the moral complexity at the heart of the entire story. The government had promised to protect Barbosa in exchange for his testimony, but ultimately they couldn't or wouldn't keep him safe. He had lived under a false identity for years before his past caught up with him, killed on a San Francisco street far from the Boston neighborhoods where he had built his reputation. But Joseph Barbosa's death was not the end of his story. In fact, the most devastating consequences of his life were only beginning to emerge. The 4 men he had falsely accused of murdering Edward Deegan, Joseph Salvati, Louis Greco, Henry Tamaleo, and Peter Limone, had been sitting in prison since 1968. They had been convicted based on Barbosa's perjured testimony that the FBI knew was false even as they allowed it to be presented in court. For decades, these innocent men rotted behind bars while the government that had knowingly participated in their wrongful convictions remained silent. Joseph Salvati proved particularly tragic. While Barbosa had been relocated to California with a new identity and government support, while he had lived as a free man for years before his murder, Salvati couldn't get parole. He sat in prison for 30 years, convicted of a crime he didn't commit, while the FBI and Justice Department possessed documents proving his innocence. William Delahunt, a Democratic congressman from Massachusetts and former district attorney in Norfolk County, asked the obvious question, is that what justice is about? The answer, according to congressional investigators who later examined the case, was a resounding no in 2002, more than 3 decades after the Deegan murder trial. The House Committee on Government Reform began investigating corruption in the FBI related to its handling of organized crime. The committee's work uncovered what Representative Dan Burton called the worst cover-up in FBI history. FBI documents obtained by the New Bedford Standard Times showed that agents had known before the Deegan murder that it was going to happen. They had known who the real killers were. They had allowed Joseph Barbosa to commit perjury on the witness stand, and they had remained silent for decades while innocent men suffered in prison for crimes they didn't commit. The revelations shocked the nation and raised profound questions about the limits of law enforcement's cooperation with criminal informants. How could FBI agents justify allowing innocent people to be convicted of murder? How could prosecutors and judges be kept in the dark about evidence that would have exonerated the accused? The answer lay in the FBI's top echelon informant program, a controversial initiative that gave agents enormous latitude in protecting valuable sources. Under this program, informants like Barbosa were considered so valuable in the fight against organized crime that almost any collateral damage, including the wrongful conviction of innocent people, was deemed acceptable. The 4 men wrongly convicted in the Deegan case eventually had their convictions overturned, but the vindication came far too late for some of them. Louis Greco and Henry Tamayo had died in prison, never experiencing freedom or having their names cleared. Joseph Salvati was finally released after 30 years behind bars, an old man whose youth and productive years had been stolen by a corrupt system. Peter Limon also gained his freedom, but the years lost could never be recovered. In 2007, a federal judge awarded the 4 men and their families $101 million in damages, finding that the FBI had deliberately withheld evidence that would have proven their innocence. The legacy of Joseph the Animal Barboza extends far beyond his personal body count or his role in the Boston gang wars. His cooperation with the FBI, while initially hailed as a major victory in the fight against organized crime, exposed fundamental flaws in how law enforcement agencies handle criminal informants. The man who was too dangerous for his own mob family proved equally dangerous to the American justice system itself. His willingness to commit perjury, combined with the FBI's willingness to enable and protect him, resulted in one of the worst miscarriages of justice in modern American history. Consider the cruel irony of Barboza's life. He was called the Animal because of his savage violence, his willingness to bite off a man's cheek or gnaw on fragments of skull. But the most devastating violence he committed, the violence that destroyed innocent families and corrupted institutions meant to protect justice, was accomplished not with knives or guns or teeth, but with words. His lies from the witness stand proved more destructive than all the bullets he had fired during the gang wars. The man who built his reputation on physical brutality ultimately caused the most harm through manipulation and deceit, the patriarcha crime. Family's decision to betray Joseph Barboza was cold-blooded, but rational from their perspective. They had created a monster, used him to eliminate their enemies, and then attempted to dispose of him when he became a liability. What they couldn't have anticipated was that the monster they created would, in his death throes, cause damage far exceeding anything he had accomplished as their enforcer. Raymond Patriarca went to prison based on Barboza's testimony. The organization fell apart as members were killed, imprisoned, or turned informant. The Patriarca family's control of New England's criminal rackets was broken. In trying to eliminate Joseph Barboza, they had destroyed themselves. But the FBI's role in this tragedy was equally troubling and perhaps more insidious. Law enforcement agencies are supposed to protect the innocent and punish the guilty, to stand as a bulwark against the chaos that people like Barboza represent. Instead, FBI agents became complicit in his crimes, allowing him to send innocent men to prison while shielding him from consequences. They created a system where the ends, bringing down the mafia, justified any means, including the destruction of innocent lives. In doing so, they betrayed not just the 4 men wrongly convicted in the Deegan case, but every citizen who trusts that the justice system operates with integrity. The emotional weight of this story doesn't rest primarily with Joseph Barboza. Despite the dramatic arc of his life from feared mob enforcer to government witness to murdered informant, the real emotional center of this narrative belongs to the innocent men whose lives were destroyed by his lies and the system that enabled him. Imagine being Joseph Salvati, sitting in a prison cell year after year, knowing you were innocent of the murder they convicted you of. Imagine watching your children grow up through glass in a visiting room, missing birthdays and graduations and weddings, all because a mobster lied and the FBI let him do it. Imagine the rage, the helplessness, the slow erosion of hope as decade followed decade with no justice in sight. Louis Greco and Henry Tamayo never experienced the vindication of having their names cleared. They died behind bars, innocent men who spent their final years in the hell of the American prison system. Their families mourned them not just as victims of crime, but as casualties of a corrupt system that was supposed to protect them. When the truth finally emerged, when FBI documents revealed the depth of the betrayal. These families had to grapple with the knowledge that their loved ones could have been saved if the government had simply told the truth. Peter Limone, who survived long enough to be exonerated, spent 33 years in prison for a crime he didn't commit. Think about that. 33 years? When he entered prison, Richard Nixon was president. When he was released, George W. Bush occupied the White House. The entire world had changed. Technology, culture, politics. While Limone sat in a cell, an innocent man trapped by institutional corruption and the lies of a mobster who had every incentive to say whatever would keep him out of prison, the $101 million settlement awarded to the victims and their families in 2007 might seem like justice. But money can't return lost years. It can't bring back Louis Greco or Henry Tamileo. It can't give Joseph Salvati back the 3 decades he spent behind bars. It can't restore the childhoods lost by the children who grew up with their fathers in prison for crimes they didn't commit. The settlement was an acknowledgement of wrongdoing, an admission that the system had failed catastrophically. But it wasn't really justice. Justice would have been never lying in the first place, never allowing an innocent person to be convicted, never protecting a murderous informant at the expense of the truth. Joseph Barboza died believing he had gotten revenge on the mob family that betrayed him. In a sense, he had. His testimony helped destroy the Patriarca organization and sent its leaders to prison. But he never understood, or perhaps never cared, that his revenge came at the cost of innocent lives. He had been called an animal because of his capacity for physical violence, but his most inhuman acts were the cold, calculated lies he told from the witness stand. A truly dangerous man isn't necessarily the one who can kill with his hands, it's the one who can destroy lives. With his words while claiming to serve justice, the FBI agents who recruited Barboza and protected him as an informant probably believed they were serving a greater good. Organized crime was a genuine threat to American society in the 1960s, and the mafia's control over major cities was extensive and damaging. Taking down mob bosses like Raymond Patriarca was important work, but the moment those agents allowed innocent people to be convicted based on testimony they knew was false, they crossed a line that should never be crossed. They became accomplices to a crime far worse than anything Barboza had done as a mob enforcer, because they corrupted the very institutions meant to stand against criminality. The title of this story asks, when the mob decided their own man was too dangerous, and the answer is clear. When Joseph Barboza became more liability than asset, when his instability and the law enforcement attention surrounding him threatened to bring down the entire organization. But there's a deeper question that the story raises. When did law enforcement decide that an innocent person's life was worth less than bringing down a mob boss? When did we collectively agree that the ends justify the means, that wrongful convictions are acceptable collateral damage in the war on crime? These questions don't have comfortable answers. The story of Joseph Barboza forces us to confront the reality that sometimes the greatest threats to justice come not from the criminals we fear, but from the institutions we trust to protect us. It reminds us that monsters can wear badges as easily as they can wear mob insignia, and that betrayal stings just as deeply, whether it comes from a crime boss or a government agent sworn to uphold the law. In the end, Joseph the Animal Barboza was exactly what the Patriarca crime family decided he was, too dangerous to live. But he was too dangerous not because of his capacity for violence, which the mob had always found useful. He was too dangerous because his betrayal exposed truths that both the criminal underworld and law enforcement would have preferred to keep hidden. He revealed that the line between the mob and the FBI was far thinner than anyone wanted to admit, that both institutions were willing to sacrifice innocent people to achieve their goals, and that the word justice sometimes meant very different things depending on which side of the law you stood. The powerful emotional twist at the heart of this story isn't Barboza's murder on a San Francisco street, though that scene has its own tragic poetry. The real twist is the realization that the most destructive monster in this entire narrative wasn't the man who bit off cheeks and gnawed on skull fragments. It was the system that created him, used him, and then allowed his lies to destroy innocent lives. We want to believe that there are clear lines separating good from evil, that law enforcement represents justice and criminals represent chaos. But the story of Joseph Barboza shows us that those lines can blur and disappear, that institutions can become corrupted, and that sometimes the greatest evil is done by people who convince themselves they're serving a greater good. Joseph Salvati, speaking after his exoneration, described the moment he learned the FBI had known all along that he was innocent. The betrayal, he said, hurt more than the decades in prison. At least when the mob sent innocent people to prison, they weren't pretending to serve justice. At least criminals didn't wrap their crimes in the flag and claim to be protecting society. The FBI's betrayal was worse because it came from people who should have known better, who had taken oaths to uphold the law and protect the innocent. This is the true legacy of Joseph the Animal Barboza, not the murders he committed or the gang wars he participated in, but the revelation that our institutions of justice can be just as corrupt and destructive as the criminals they claim to fight. When the mob decided their own man was too dangerous, they were making a practical calculation about self-preservation. When the FBI decided that innocent people's lives were acceptable losses in their war against organized crime, they were making a moral calculation that should haunt us all. And that's the twist that makes this story truly tragic. The realization that sometimes the real monsters are the ones we trust to protect us from the dark.